Hi everyone, my name is Dominic Arhado. I'm a web developer, and these are guides, tips, and tricks to web development. So this is a continuation of the part one where we built a OTP input in React and TypeScript. So now for this part, we'll be writing tests for that component. So just a recap, we have built a OTP input in React in input boxes. So I can type 1 digit per box. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I can delete them. I can delete in the middle, and this 4, 5 will still be intact. And I can also delete and move back to the first input, and I can type in. I can also copy this code and paste it anywhere I want. I will paste in the middle, and it will paste everything. And I can also move using my arrow keys throughout the input boxes. So this is our OTP input. So now it's time to write some tests for it. So coming back from our code, we can now stop this local development running. We can install a library in our dependency, which we will be using for our tests. So it will be Faker. So what is Faker? So Faker helps us generate massive amounts of fake but realistic data for testing. So we'll be using it for testing. You can go to their guide to see all the APIs they have. You can generate fake name, random word or numeric, data type, numbers, anything you can think of. They have it to like help you generate a random one. So it makes our test more, more trustworthy, and you have more confidence in your tests. So we'll just install this. All right, so now it's installed. What you want to do now is basically, or what I like to do is basically put all the test files in a separate folder so that it's not messy, or it's not as cluttered in the main file. So this is our main files. We want the test to be separate from the main files. So we'll put it in the double underscore tests double underscore. That's where we'll put our tests. So we'll be testing OTP input. So it's good to copy that naming as well and create that test.tsx. So this is the file that we'll be testing OTP input. So what does a test file contain? So if this is your first time writing tests for a component, basically you start with importing the file first, OTP input, from OTP input. And then now you can describe what you are testing. So using the describe, this is a global function from JS testing library, and you can just immediately use it. And then you're going to be describing what you're testing. So I'm just going to use the component name because that's what I'm going to test. And yeah, inside the describe, you can basically write each test case you want to test. So it will be it, or it can be test. So both are the same. And I like to use it more. So it should accept value and value length props. So this is where we will write our test cases. So we will be describing what the test case is all about inside the first argument as a string, and then the function will basically be run when you run this test file. All right, so what I like to do before I start is basically create a reusable function called render component. And then use the render function, which is not the React DOM, but the testing library, because we'll be rendering in a test environment. So testing library by React provides you a function to render your component in a test environment. All right. As you can see, OTP inputs, this test file is also a TypeScript file. So it will also complain if you're not following the type definition. So we need to pass props here. So I can do like this. Like when we call the function, we will be passing the props, but I don't have the type. So what I like to do, basically export this and then import it here. So now I have the type, which is same as what we define in the file itself. So we don't have to repeat it. You can just use it straight away. And then we just spread the props right here. So now the error is gone. We can start writing our test. So this is how normally the setup for writing tests in a component. So the reason why I use a reusability function is that, for example, our OTP input file or the naming of our component would change. We just need to change within this lines. If, for example, we have to keep calling this function in every test cases, then we have to change it multiple times. So this reduces the chances of, making a loud change when you're just doing a rename. So that's basically it. All right, so what do we do now? Basically, when we check for the value and value length, whatever we're passing in the value becomes an array of input boxes. And each of the digit will be assigned to each of the input boxes. The value length defines how many input boxes are there. So you get the idea of what we are testing here, right? So first, of course, we need to render the component. And it requires some props. It requires a value length, and an on change. So we can generate, remember we installed Faker. We can generate random digits of a string using the data type number. Which we have right here. Let's import it. I have imported Faker. And it has a function under data types. There's a number. So number accepts minimum and maximum. So what we want is basically from 0, we accept 1 digit, that's fine. So from 0 to 9 would be 1 digit, and 6 digit would become until 999. So anything in between these numbers, we are fine with that. And since this is a number, a type number, value is a string, so we need to convert it into a string. Okay, so now we have a value that we can pass here. How about the value length? Value length, I'm just going to use the same one as what we have in the value. So value that length, that will be our value length. That is fine. For the onChange, we're not going to check anything yet. So we can actually just pass an anonymous function. But I like to introduce to you what we call a mock function in Jest. So in Jest, we have this thing called mock function. We're not going to do anything to it yet, but it's just merely using as a dummy props for now, because we're not checking this yet. We're only checking for this particular test case, which is the value and value length props. All right. So now what do we need to check? Basically, we need to check that the number of input boxes is the same as value length. How do we query for the elements in the DOM? So it is advisable to use the screen from testing library as well. So we need to get the input elements and use the screen, which will be imported from testing library. And it has a query. It has different queries. It can be queried by text, by title, by row, by placeholder text. We'll be using query by row, and we want all the elements. So query all by row. And an input box basically has a role of a text box. So this is what we need to just query for the thing. And yeah, this will return an array of input elements. We can basically do our check that the input elements has a length the same as our value length. So this is how we do our checks for each test cases. We're using the expect, which is a global function by Jest. And this is what we call a custom matcher. Basically checks that it has a length. So there's different kinds of matchers. So to have, to be, to equal, to contain HTML, to have text context, there's a lot. And I'll provide a link in the description below for you to check the rest. But this is to check the length of an array. So since it is an array, we compare the length is the same as the value length. So how do we run our first test case? We can do yarn test, and I like to pass in the parameter coverage, which will display the coverage of the test cases. This way, we will know what are the uncovered lines that we need to cover. All right, so our test case passed. As you can see, this was our first test case, and it will display a pass here. And we have covered the lines, a few lines, but there's still a lot of lines to cover. So let's proceed. So yeah, this is your first test case, but we can actually improve this test case because we're only checking for the length of the input box. But since we are also checking for the value, we need to make sure that each of the input box contains the correct digits. So we can convert the value string here into a value array. Remember, we can use split. So this will be an array now. All we can do is we look into the input elements. So this will become an input element, and this will be its index. What do we want to check? We expect the input element. So there's another custom method to have value. So the input element should have a value that is based on its position. So using the index, value array, index. So that is it. Now you can, when you save the changes, it will automatically rerun the test because that's how the script has been built. So that's good for local development and writing tests. You don't have to keep running that script. And there you go, it's still passed. And now we can move on to our next test case. So our second test case is basically we should allow typing of digits. This is where the on change will come in. So basically, first let's render our component. So when we're typing digits, if you remember, once we type, it focuses on to the next element. So aside from checking that the value is inputted on the on change event, it should also focus to the next element. So do note on that, we'll be testing that as well. So first, the value, we don't want it to be, we want it to be empty to trigger the change event. So let's just leave it as empty, but the value length, we can generate a random number. So using Faker, data type number, we basically want minimum of 2, because if it's just 1, then we cannot check that the next element is has the focus. We can only do it if there's at least 2 input boxes to know that or to check that logic. And you can just set as the max as 6 input boxes. I think that's good enough. And then here we're gonna initiate the on change mock function because we'll be checking this later. Now what do we need to do? So again, we can loop this. We can query for the input elements again, and we can loop it. And yeah, instead of doing this check, we're basically gonna generate a random digit to be input on this particular input element. So let's create a random digit. Again, it should be a number or a digit. So minimum of 0 and maximum of 9. Plus the typing of digits is only 1 digit per input box. So we only need from 0 to 9. And we need to convert this into a string. And how do we trigger a change event in a test environment? This is where we use another library from testing library, which is called fire event. So fire event has some properties which we can call. So for example, change event, key down event, focus event. So there's tons of DOM events or the document object model events that we can call. So here we just need the change. First argument will be the element, so input element. And then the second argument is optional. So we can actually modify the event data that is being passed on the change event. Remember, we have a event data right here. This is the event data, so for the change event. So we can modify that. What do we need to modify? We can modify the value that is being passed in the event data. This is where we can put the digit. All right, so after we trigger the change, what do we need to check? So we need to check that the on change was called. So we can expect on change to be called ×1. So you don't want it called multiple times, just one is enough. And we can also check that it has been called with the digit. All right, so that means that our on change is working properly. And then remember, as you type in, the next input element should be focus. But on the last part, it will remain on the same element. So we can do like an OR condition here. Input focus should be on the input element. Input elements, let's get the array. Then we can use the index +1 to get the next element sibling from the array of inputs. And we can do an OR. If the next element doesn't exist, then it should be in the current. So basically, we can expect that the input focus will have focus. And since this is an iteration or a loop, the on change will not change. It will keep increasing the call times as you loop through. So to reset that, we want to reset in every iteration the on change. So you can do mock reset. And that way it will not be, this test, this check will not fail. So let's save the changes and see our test case. So this should pass as well. And there you go. Our second test case has passed. We can now move on to the next one. So since we are checking for allowing typing of digits, we should also check for, for not allowing to type non-digits characters. So let's just copy this. And should not allow typing of non-digits. So what we just need to change a couple of things here. So basically this should not be a digit. This will be a non-digit. So you can use alpha, random alpha. So it will be random alphabet letter. And this is already a string. You can just pass this. And remember, we're not doing anything when it is not a digit. So on change should not, we can call the not property to be called. So here we're checking that it should not be called. So on change, mock function should not be called. And we don't need to check the focus anymore. We just need to reset the on change mock. All right, so that is it for our third test case. We don't need the index anymore. Let's see if this pass. All right, so it passed as well. Now let's move on to the next test case. As you can see, our uncovered lines has been reducing. So as we write more tests, this one decreases. So what else should we check? So you can test for the, as you can type, you can also delete. So we should write the test. It should allow deleting of digits. So if we're going to delete, the input element should have at least a value inside of it. So we're going to copy something similar like here. Let's see. All right, so in the deletion, let's try to visualize that. Once we delete this, the value in this element disappears, but the focus is still in the current element. But if I do a delete again, it focuses to the previous element. So do note on that, as we're gonna test that as well. Okay, so to check that going to the previous element to focus on it, we need at least 2-digit. We cannot reproduce this in a 1-digit code, so it needs to be 10. Okay, so we don't need the value array yet. Okay, what do we need to do? So basically we need to loop from the start, from the last index. So let's write in the last index. So last index will be the value length -1. We need to loop backwards. So from the start of 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, we're going to start from here. So we need to loop. Let the index be the last index, and index should be greater than -1 and minus minus. So it should be index minus minus. All right, then we can get the input element from the input elements using the index. So what do we need to do? So we need to trigger a change event. So like what we used earlier, trigger a change event in the input element inside the target value. Since we are deleting, basically the value inside will be an empty string. So this is how it triggers the deletion. And also, we need to fire key down event as well. Remember, that's how we handle on the key down, we handle the backspace. So we need to trigger input element, and the key would be backspace. And same thing, target will be the same as this. So maybe I can just create a constant here to reduce the duplication. Target. All right. So now both of these events have been triggered. Now we can do some checks. So the check right here is basically, for example, we have generated, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as a string. Imagine this is what has been generated. At this point, when we start from 6, the string would be something like this, because we are changing the empty space into a space so that we keep the number of input boxes. Remember this part? We are replacing empty string into a space. So we need to basically check that the value or the on change would return something like this. So let's construct that. So first we need to convert the value into an array. Then we already know what's the current index. So basically in the value array, using the current index, we replace it with a space. And then we basically can reconstruct this string by using join. Okay, so now we have this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The expected value now is something like this. So this is what happened. Okay, so I'm just going to delete the comments. And now we can do the expect. So we expect on change. The on change function. Let me just put it here. Okay, we expect on change to be called one time. And we also to be called with. So the on chain has been called with this expected value. And of course, you need to reset it because this is a loop. What else can we do here? Remember the focus. When we're deleting something that's already empty, the focus should go to the previous element. So I'm going to copy this, but instead of +1, it will be -1 because this is the previous element. So if the previous element doesn't exist, it will be the focus would remain on the current element. So let's see what happens. Once I've saved the changes, And there you go, it's still pass. And let's see the uncovered lines. Again, it's reducing. So let's proceed to the next one. So we also need to basically allow deleting of digits. But for example, there's a value. We don't want to focus to the previous element. We need to test it as well because that's part of our logic. So how do we do that? Let's just basically copy this again. And I'm going to rename the description here. So basically focus on previous element, but the next one, we still allow deleting, but do not focus on previous element. All right. So again, we're going to use the same here. And we're also going to change this to 0 because on the first input element, there's no previous element, but the second one does have, and so on and so forth. So we're only going to check from the second until the second input element. And then we don't need to trigger the change anymore. We can also just do this, replace this with target value, and then the value of the string. So we can create a value array here instead. We don't need the rest of the codes right here. So it should, so when we did a backspace, there's still a value inside. So if there's a value, you won't focus on the input. So we can just do like previous input, previous input element does not have the focus. So let's save the changes and check. All right, so this is still pass and everything is green. All right, so there's still a couple of lines to cover. So let's move on. What's the next thing we need to test? So after typing, allowing deleting, now we should also allow pasting. It should allow pasting of digits. So when we do pasting in digits, we always make sure that it has the same length as the value length. All right, and maybe we can copy the digits since we always want to start as empty when we do a paste as well. That's how it will trigger the on change. Okay. So value is empty here, but I can define what I want to paste. Maybe right below. Okay, I don't need to do these checks. So what do we need to do? So we need to trigger a paste event. So remember in paste event, we can paste it anywhere in the input box. So you can either loop through all the input box, but what I'm going to do is I just need any random input box. So any random index, taker.data type, the number. So minimum index is 0. Then maximum would be input or the value length -1. So any random index from the input elements. Now we can get the random input element using the random index. All right. So this can be any of the 6 digits right here because we are having 6 digits or 2 to 6 digits. And we're going to fire not paste event, but change event still, because that's where we handle the paste event. So in the random input element, we want to just paste the value. So let's generate a fake value or pasted value. Should be a number from 10 to maximum 999. to string. So since we're going to be pasting same length as the value length, we actually need to declare it here, and that the value length should be value length, and it should be minimum of 2 digits, because if it's 1 digit, it is not a paste event. 1 digit is for typing of digits, but this is the paste event. All right, so it needs to be minimum of 2 digits, so from 10 to 999. Okay. What do we need? What do you expect? So we expect one change to be called times 1 and to be called with what we have pasted. So we pasted value. We pasted value. And remember, we are not focusing on any of the input elements. So we just expect the random input element to not have the focus. All right. So I think this is it. Let's save the changes and see what's the status of our coverage. Boom. So still pass. Great. And we're left with 2 uncovered lines. So from 84 to 85 and 89 to 90. But before we proceed to that, I just want to remind you that we are checking for the same length as value length. So we have covered this. We have covered this. So this is an if and else if, but we haven't covered for the else condition. Although it's not written in code, later on, once you finish completing this 2, you'll come back and say that line 72 is not covered, because else is still part of the coverage, even though it's not written there, because this is an else if. So let's just cover that now. Basically, not same length as our base event. So we can do like less than value length. All right, so what do we need to do? So we can generate a random digit from 10 to 99, that's fine. But for the value length, we need to have more than 6 digits. So more than 6 digits, maybe we reduce this to 5. And then maximum of value length will be, so from 6 to 10, that will be the value length. But our digit only is for 2 to 5 digit code. So that will not trigger the paste event. So this should be not a string. All right, so what happens? The on change would not be called because it is less than the value length, not to be called. All right. So let's see if this still passes. All right, so we pass a value or the digit that is from 2 digit to 5 digit, but our value length could be 6 to 10. So this case, it should not allow pasting of digits if it's less than the value length. All right, so yeah, what's left in our uncovered lines? 84 to 85, 89 to 90. If you check to the OTP input component, 84 to 85 is the arrow right down, and 88 to 89 is the arrow left. So the arrow function logics are the ones that we haven't covered yet. So let's proceed to that. So we should focus to the next element. Remember, when we're pressing the arrow keys, it's focusing to the next element, previous element. So this happens on the right or down key. So what do we need to do? Again, I can just render with an empty string. Value length should be minimum at least 2. I'm going to do 3 here because I'm going to do this manually. I won't be looping. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. So again, we need to query for all the input elements. And let's get the first input element. First input element is basically just the input elements in index 0. You fire an event, which is a key down event, with a key of arrow right. So once this is triggered, what happens? We expect the second element, or the second input element, which is in index 1. So we remember we have 3 input blocks because we define the value length as 3. To have focus. All right, so maybe I'll save this first, just to see if this passes. And yes, it does. Now I can just do an extra one. Basically, I fire another key down event. But this time, I'm not going to use arrow right, I'm going to use arrow down. So you see I've combined these two, because anyway, it's the same logic. It's just different keys. So this time, if I did trigger this event, the third input element, which is in index 2, should have the focus. So this should pass as well. There you go. Oops. Okay. Oh, we triggered the event on the first, but it should be on the second input element because that's where the focus is. All right, so once we triggered that, and it should pass. All right, so you already know what we're going to do next for the left arrow key. We're just basically gonna copy this, change a couple of things. So we need to do the reverse. So we're going to start from the third element. And then if you trigger the left, this would become the input element. And if we trigger up as well. Okay, so we started from the third. If you trigger the key down event on third using the arrow keys, you will be focused on the second element. If you trigger the arrow up key down event, it will go back to, you will focus on the first input element. So let's save this and see what happens. All right, so I think something failed. So this should be index 0. So first input element is 0. So we start from the back, 2, 1, 0. So here is 0, 1, 2. So let's see if that passed now. All right, so we are done. If you can see, the input element has 100% test coverage. That means we are done writing tests for this component. I hope this was easy enough for you to understand and learn how to write tests for such component like OTP input. So we are done. So I hope you learned a lot from this video. Please do share it to anyone you think might find this video helpful. And let's make OTP inputs great again. Remember, there's a lot of OTP inputs out there that's not created or implemented properly. So please share this to make OTP inputs great again. So thank you so much for your time and see you in the next video. Bye.